At dawn on October 25, 1944, lookouts aboard the USS Samuel B. Roberts spotted pagoda masts on the horizon. For a moment, the identification seemed impossible. Those distinctive silhouettes belonged to Japanese battleships, massive capital ships that had no business being anywhere near Leyte Gulf. But the masts were real, and they were getting closer. Behind them came the unmistakable shapes of heavy cruisers, destroyers, and more battleships. The most powerful surface action group the Imperial Japanese Navy could assemble was bearing down on Taffy 3, a formation of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The Samuel B. Roberts was one of those destroyer escorts, a ship so small the Navy didn't even consider it a proper warship. Destroyer escorts were built for convoy duty, for hunting submarines, for screening supply ships. They displaced 350 tons. They carried 2 5-inch guns, 3 40mm anti-aircraft mounts, and 3 torpedoes. They were cheap, mass-produced, expendable. The Roberts had a crew of 224 men, most of them barely out of their teens, many on their first combat deployment. Racing toward them was the center force of the Japanese Navy's desperation gambit to destroy the American landing fleet at Leyte. 4 battleships, including the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, displacing 72,000 tons and mounting 9 18.1-inch guns that could hurl shells weighing over a ton, more than 20 miles. 6 heavy cruisers, each one larger than the Roberts, each mounting 8-inch guns that could obliterate the little destroyer escort with a single salvo. 2 light cruisers and 11 destroyers completed the formation. The mathematics were obscene. The Japanese force outweighed Taffy 3 by a factor of more than 10 to 1. A single Japanese battleship mounted more firepower than the entire American formation. The escort carriers' Kaiser-built merchant hulls with flight decks welded on top were slow unarmored, armed with a single 5-inch gun each. They were meant to provide air support for ground troops, not fight surface engagements. Their aircraft were loaded with depth charges and high-explosive bombs for ground attack, not armor-piercing weapons that could damage battleships. Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, ordered the carriers to run south and make smoke. He ordered the destroyers and destroyer escorts to attack. The order was tantamount to a death sentence. Sprague knew it. The commanders of the small ships knew it. But if the carriers were to have any chance of escape, the escorts had to buy time. They had to get between the Japanese guns and the carriers. They had to make the enemy fleet react, maneuver, divide their fire, even if it killed them. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, captain of the Samuel B. Roberts, didn't hesitate. His ship was the smallest and slowest in Taffy 3. At 24 knots maximum speed, the Roberts couldn't catch the destroyers already charging toward the enemy. But Copeland ordered his engine room to somehow find more speed. The engine crew responded by coaxing power. The designers never intended pushing the ship past its rated capacity tubes, vibrating, bearings, screaming. The Roberts shook and rattled, but accelerated to nearly 28 knots. The scale of what they were attempting defied comprehension. The Roberts was 306 feet long. The Yamato was 863 feet long. The Roberts displaced 1,350 tons. The Japanese heavy cruiser Chokai displaced 13,400 tons. The Roberts' main battery consisted of 2 5-inch guns firing 55-pound shells. The Yamato's main battery consisted of 9 18.1-inch guns firing 3 200-pound shells. One Yamato shell weighed more than an entire broadside from the Roberts. But the Roberts charged anyway. The crew went to battle stations knowing exactly what they faced. Fire controlman John Leclerc, in the Director, looked through his rangefinder and saw the massive shapes of the enemy fleet. Gunner's mate Paul Carr and his crew loaded the aft 5-inch gun. Torpedo men prepared the 3 Mark 15 torpedoes, the only weapons the Roberts carried that could possibly damage a battleship. Damage control parties stood ready. The cooks and stewards, having no battle stations, volunteered to pass ammunition. Japanese shells began falling around the formation. Splashes rose hundreds of feet in the air, colored dye, marking which ship fired which salvo, allowing Japanese spotters to correct their aim. Red splashes from one battleship, green from another, yellow from the cruisers. The ocean erupted in geysers of coloured water. The shells howled overhead like freight trains. The destroyers reached firing range first. USS Johnston, USS Hull, and USS Herman made their torpedo runs, weaving through shell splashes, firing their torpedoes, turning to engage with guns. The Johnston had already been hit and was burning but still fighting. The Hoel was taking repeated hits. The Japanese formation was forced to maneuver to avoid the torpedoes, buying precious minutes for the carriers. The Roberts kept coming. Copeland positioned his ship between the Japanese heavy cruisers and the carriers. The range closed to 10,000 yards, then 8,000. The Roberts' two 5-inch guns opened fire. The shells arced toward the heavy cruiser Chokai, one of Japan's finest warships. The 5-inch projectiles were pinpricks against a ship that size, but the Roberts' gunners were superb. They'd trained endlessly. They knew their weapons. They fired for effect. The forward gun crew under Lieutenant William Burton worked with mechanical precision. Load, aim, fire. Load, aim, fire. The gun could fire 15 rounds per minute in theory. The crew exceeded that. Shells flew downrange in a steady stream. The aft gun, manned by Paul Carr's crew, matched the pace. Both guns hammered away at the Japanese cruisers. At 4,000 yards, well inside the range, where the Japanese could obliterate them, the Roberts fired its 3 torpedoes. The weapons ran true, streaking toward the Japanese line at 45 knots. The enemy cruisers turned to comb the torpedo tracks, presenting their narrow bows to reduce the target area. The torpedoes missed. Japanese ship handling was excellent, but the maneuver disrupted the enemy formation and pulled the cruisers out of position. The Roberts turned to run, making smoke but didn't retreat. Copeland kept the ship between the Japanese and the carriers, continuing to fire. The 5-inch guns shifted targets to the heavy cruiser Tone, then to another cruiser, then back to Chokai. The Japanese returned fire with 8-inch salvos. The disparity was brutal. Each Japanese heavy cruiser could fire 10 8-inch shells per minute from its 10-gun main battery. Each shell weighed 260 pounds. The Roberts could fire 30 55-pound shells per minute from its 2 guns. But volume of fire matters. The Roberts was landing hits. The 5-inch shells couldn't penetrate the cruiser's armor belt, but they could damage superstructure, destroy fire control equipment, kill exposed crew members. One Roberts shell hit Chokai's forward fire room, rupturing steam lines. Another hit destroyed range-finding equipment. The damage wasn't fatal, but it was real. The tiny destroyer Escort was hurting ships 10 times its size. For nearly an hour, the Roberts fought. The crew reloaded ammunition until the ready magazines ran dry, then formed human chains, passing shells up from the lower magazines. The 5-inch guns grew so hot, the paint burned off the barrels. Spent shell casings piled up around the gun mounts. The crew worked in smoke and heat, and the constant shriek of enemy shells overhead. Then the Japanese found the range. An 8-inch shell from the cruiser Congo struck the Roberts aft, penetrating the thin hull and exploding inside the engine room. The blast killed everyone in the engine spaces, instantly torn apart by the explosion or scalded to death by superheated steam. The Roberts lost power and began to slow. More hits followed. A shell penetrated the hull amidships. Another hit the superstructure. Fires broke out. The ship began taking on water. Still the crew fought. The forward gun continued firing. The aft gun kept shooting until a shell struck the mount directly. Paul Carr was loading the gun when the hit came. The explosion tore through the mount, killing most of the crew instantly. Carr was mortally wounded, disemboweled by shrapnel burns covering his body. When damage control parties reached the gun mount, they found Carr still at his post, clutching a 55-pound shell trying to load the gun. He refused medical attention. He refused to leave his station. He begged them to help him load one more round. He wanted to fire one more shot at the enemy. Lieutenant Burton arrived and tried to help Carr load the shell, but the gun was too damaged. The breech was jammed. Carr died moments later, still holding the shell, still trying to fight. He was 23 years old. The Roberts continued to take hits. The ship was dying. Fires burned out of control. The list increased. Water poured through holes in the hull. Copeland gave the order to abandon ship. The crew went over the side into water covered with oil and debris under fire from Japanese ships that continued to shell the sinking vessel. The Roberts rolled over and sank stern first at 09:05, 50 minutes after the engagement began. Of the 224 men aboard 89 were killed in action or died in the water. The survivors spent 2 days floating in shark-infested waters before rescue ships found them. But the Roberts didn't die alone. The other escorts of Taffy 3 fought with equal determination. The destroyer Johnston engaged Japanese battleships and cruisers for hours before being sunk. The Hoel charged the enemy line and was blown apart. The destroyer escort Dennis launched torpedoes at battleships. The destroyer escort Raymond fought off attacking cruisers. The destroyer Herman maneuvered so aggressively that at one point it passed between the escort carriers and the Japanese battle line, taking hits meant for the carriers. The carriers launched every aircraft they had, regardless of armament. Planes loaded with depth charges attacked battleships. Fighters strafed bridge windows with machine guns. Pilots made dry runs attacking without weapons just to force Japanese ships to maneuver. One pilot flew repeated runs over a battleship's bridge, firing his pistol at the windows. The Japanese force reeled under the chaos. Ships maneuvered to avoid torpedoes breaking formation. Air attacks forced constant evasive action. Shell splashes from the tiny 5-inch guns walked across their decks. The smoke screens reduced visibility. Reports came in of what Japanese commanders thought were fleet carriers launching major airstrikes, actually the escort carriers launching everything that could fly. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the Japanese force, made a fatal decision. Confused by the ferocious resistance, convinced he was engaging fleet carriers rather than escort carriers, worried about submarine attacks and airstrikes, he ordered withdrawal. His force had overwhelming superiority. He could have destroyed Taffy 3 completely, but the suicidal attacks by the escorts convinced him he faced a much stronger force. He turned away. The little ships had won, not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through sheer audacity and willingness to die. They charged battleships in destroyer escorts. They fired pop guns at cruisers. They launched torpedoes at ranges where enemy shells could physically see the whites of their eyes. They fought until their ships sank beneath them. The heroism defied measurement. Carr trying to load his gun while dying. The engine room crew staying at their posts when the hit came, knowing they'd die but keeping the ship moving. The ammunition passers forming human chains to keep the guns firing. The damage control parties fighting fires under enemy bombardment. The cooks and stewards passing ammunition fighting fires, pulling wounded men to safety. Copeland survived and spent decades honouring his crew. He never claimed to be a hero. He said he was just the captain of heroes. He was right. The Roberts was manned by ordinary young men, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, kids from small towns across America. They'd been in the Navy less than 2 years. Most had never seen combat before later Gulf. But when the moment came, when impossible odds appeared on the horizon, they didn't hesitate. They charged. They fought. They died at their posts. Not because they were superhuman, not because they didn't understand the odds. They fought because their training held, because they trusted their shipmates, because duty mattered more than survival. The Navy awarded the Samuel B. Roberts a Presidential Unit Citation. Copeland received the Navy Cross. Paul Carr received the Silver Star posthumously. But no medal could capture what happened that morning off Samar. A 350-ton destroyer escort engaged ships 50 times its size. A crew of 224 men attacked the most powerful surface action force the Japanese Navy could field. They knew they would probably die. They attacked anyway. Admiral Sprague later said of the escorts, "In no engagement of its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts and gumption than in those 2 morning hours between 07:30 and 09:30 off Samar. The Japanese force that withdrew from Leyte Gulf could have destroyed the landing beaches, could have wrecked the entire Philippine campaign. The invasion might have failed. The war might have lasted months longer. But they turned away because a handful of small ships charged into a battle they couldn't win and fought with such ferocity that the enemy believed they faced a force far more powerful. The Roberts and its crew bought time with their lives. The carriers escaped. The landings succeeded. The Philippines were liberated. The war moved toward its end. And somewhere off Samar, 17,000 feet down the wreck of the Samuel B. Roberts rests on the seafloor, the deepest shipwreck ever discovered, found in 2022 by explorers who wanted to honor the ship and crew that embodied everything the Navy claimed to be. The outcome was doubtful. They did their duty, and in doing so, they won.